Good afternoon. I'm Christy Paling, the Upper Cumberland Regional Coordinator with the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. We are so pleased to offer this second virtual training in the series with Pastor Palmer. We're very excited you've joined us, so welcome. Today, we have a small pre-selected group of folks representing many agencies in all 9 regions across the state that will be interacting with Pastor Palmer with questions and comments throughout the training. You are also welcome to ask questions in the chat box. We will do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. Please refrain from using the Q&A as we will be monitoring the chat box. We certainly appreciate your support, patience, and grace with our transition to a virtual platform for our educational events. You will be muted so we do not experience any audio interference. Also, this training will be recorded. Certificates of participation and NASW CEU certificates will be emailed out to you starting next week. Time and attendance will be monitored for CEU certificates as requirements dictate full participation. A special note to all those calling into the training: if you need a participant or a CEU certificate, please email our Memphis Shelby County Regional Coordinator, Gwendolyn Wright. That's gwendolyn.wright@tn.gov with your name and certificate request so we can capture your participation. At this time, I would like to introduce Richard Kennedy, our Executive Director, to share a few words. Richard?
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us today. As Christy said, I have the great privilege to serve as the Executive Director of the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. We're so thankful to all of our 9 regional coordinators for organizing today's event, and I appreciate the many ways they have adapted during this pandemic to continue to serve Tennessee's children. I'd also like to quickly thank partners at the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services for their help in making this happen today. Today's event was made possible through funding from a federal System of Care grant. System of Care is a philosophy that is charged with ensuring that services and supports provided to children, youth, young adults, and families are family-driven, youth-guided, community-based, and culturally and linguistically competent, and requires training on those components. The content shared today will be those of the presenter and do not represent any official view of the state of Tennessee, the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, or the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth. TCCY acknowledges, and we know, that there is always opportunity to improve cultural competency. We hope this webinar today will encourage conversation amongst yourselves and your peers to continue dialogue that leads to the best Tennessee we can be. At this point, it is my definite pleasure to introduce Craig Hardrow, who serves as the Deputy Executive Director of TCCY and who will introduce Pastor Palmer. Craig.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague of mine, Pastor Edward Palmer. Senior is the co-pastor with his wife, Elizabeth Palmer, for the Sign of Dove Church International, located in Radcliffe, Kentucky. He is a certified diversity trainer and works to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities within the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. He is a certified racial and ethnic disparities capstone project fellow through the Center of Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University. He chairs the Kentucky State Interagency Council's Diversity Standing Committee. He's the chair of the National Coalition for Juvenile Justice. Pastor Palmer is currently serving his 5th term as a Radcliffe City Councilman. His recent awards include the following: a 2017 Kentucky Martin Luther King Jr. Leadership Award and the Courage for Kids Award for Kentucky Youth Advocates, and the 2018 System of Care Champion Award, the 2019 Thurgood Marshall Award presented by Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, Inc. Pastor Palmer definitely operates with unyielding passion. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Pastor Edward Palmer, Sr.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I want to thank the TCCY and all those who work behind the scenes to make this possible. My co-presenter, Jill, is working behind the scenes to run all the videos. I want to thank Bill for being on here to make sure we don't have any technical problems. Thank Craig for that great introduction. I'm excited to be here, excited to have this second iteration of conversations with you all around racial and ethnic disparities. Today, we're going to go on a journey about understanding culture and how to avoid cultural collisions. As many of you have seen the many images in the news, you're probably realizing that at this point, there's a lot of racial and cultural unrest in the country. And so this training is geared towards helping us understand those cultural differences that we have and avoid those cultural differences from becoming cultural collisions. And so I hope that you receive something that will help you today to avoid that collision at that intersection of race and culture, where folks believe differently, have different traditions than you. How do we maneuver through that intersection so that we don't have a cultural collision? So let's get the there we go. PowerPoint's a little late. So our ground rules or learning community behaviors today is simply, let's be fully present. I know everyone's working from home. You've got distractions around you in some cases. And so to the degree you can be fully present, we appreciate that. Let's be self-responsible for change. Let's be open-minded. All of these conversations that we have around race, around culture, around disparities requires an open mind, right? There are no wrong answers. There are no wrong experiences. Let's just keep our minds open to everyone's questions, everyone's experiences. Let's not be afraid to ask questions, especially the all-important question, why? Excuse me. Let's understand and respect the process. Let's be soft on people but hard on barriers to understanding, right? So not everything said today you will agree with, but let's be soft on the individuals and let's be hard on those barriers that will prevent us from understanding one another. Let's be productive. Let's remain solution-oriented. Let's honor confidentiality, right? So you may be on this call with some of your coworkers. They may be transparent in some of their experiences. Let's not take that back to the workplace and use it against folks. And then your participation in these activities and discussions is not mandatory, but appreciated. So if for some reason you feel like it's a little bit heavy, you need to take a break. The good news is I'm not in your face in a physical location, so you probably have a button you can push, and I'll magically go away. And then when you feel comfortable, push another button and rejoin us. I've only had that happen once in 5 years of training, and so hopefully we'll have a successful experience today. Our objectives for this session is to consider what is meant by the term culture and how culture impacts behavior. To understand the connection between both the behavior of those we serve and the various agencies you serve, as well as the impact of culture on the response of the system personnel. We're going to learn, I hope you learn to recognize when we're at an intersection of culture and race. And then I'll introduce you to some skills that hopefully will help you minimize the possibilities of a cultural collision occurring at cultural intersections. So as we get into the second half of the training, you know, I want to say that I intentionally put forth some images that could provoke a response. And that response could be good, that response could be bad. But it's my attempt to bring us to that intersection of race and culture where we differ on opinions and differ on beliefs. And then really talk us through how to make it through that tense moment without a collision, right? Without destroying somebody, without responding to an individual because they're so different than us with some negative or destructive reaction, especially if we're the decision maker in the situation and somebody presents with a cultural nuance that just offends us. How do we work through that? So I'm warning you now that in that second half, I'm very intentional in trying to bring us to that tense moment, just to help us walk through it, okay? So I just want to let you know, and I'll warn you again when we get to that moment. So as Jill prepares to key up this video, This is a video clip from the movie A Time to Kill, Matthew McConaughey's closing argument. And what I see in this video is Matthew McConaughey trying to help the jury kind of work through this tense moment around race and culture. So not sure if some of you guys I noticed on the chat room said that you have problems hearing. So I can only hope that some of you guys heard the video and actually saw it. I saw a couple of chats, so I don't know if that was everyone or just a few people. But I think what Matthew McConaughey is attempting to do in this particular clip is really to humanize the little girl. This trial had become so divided on the issue of race that I think folks had begun to forget that it was really about a little girl who had been brutally sexually assaulted and left for dead. And that was his attempt to humanize the case around this little girl again and help them to get over the issue of race that was really dominating the trial. Anybody had any thoughts or comments about this video as you watched it and think about the subject matter today? Anybody had any comments before I move forward? All right, so the golden rule. Anybody want to tell me what the golden rule is? Anybody heard of the golden rule? What were you told as a kid growing up? This is the golden rule. Anybody want to share that with me? All right, the golden rule. Treat others the way you want to be treated, right? We've all heard that, right? Treat people the way you want to be treated. And I suggest to you that this rule, when it comes to the issue of cultural competency and understanding cultural social, the golden rule comes up short. And here's why I say the golden rule comes up short. Because the golden rule assumes that we have the same beliefs. So if you treat me the way you want to be treated, then you'll treat me in a way that's based on your belief system. Our belief systems may be totally different. And so by treating me the way you want to be treated based on your beliefs, you may inadvertently offend me, right? This rule assumes that we have the same beliefs. This rule makes the assumption that we have the same needs, when in fact we may not have the same needs. And again, if you make that assumption, you may, unintentionally be an offense instead of a help. This rule assumes that we have the same goals. This rules make the assumption that we have the same experiences, when in fact we don't. And so treating me from your cultural lens, the way you want to be treated, could in some way be offensive, right? And so it's important that we understand one another's cultural nuances so that we avoid those uncomfortable and inappropriate moments. So I suggest to you the platinum rule. The platinum rule simply says, treat others the way they want to be treated. Instead of making all these assumptions about me based on your culture, that what's normal for you is normal for me, what's right for you is right for me, what you believe is what I believe. Instead of making those assumptions, right, treat me the way I want to be treated. I should seek to treat you the way you want to be treated. And what makes the platinum rule difficult is because I've got to overcome some of those assumptions. And I've got to be willing to acknowledge your beliefs. If I'm going to treat you the way you want to be treated, I have to be able to acknowledge your beliefs, which means I have to come to some level of understanding, awareness about your beliefs. And I have to realize that your beliefs may not be in agreement with my beliefs. And I'm trying to avoid this cultural collision with someone who has beliefs that are different than mine. And so this rule acknowledges the beliefs of others. This rule acknowledges their needs. And again, their needs may not be the same as yours. What's important to you may not be as important to another, right? This rule acknowledges my goals. And again, my goals may be different. This rule acknowledges my experiences, right? Don't seek to remake them. Don't seek to invalidate them, but acknowledges my experiences, right? And this helps us to avoid these cultural collisions, right? We're seeing these cultural, as I read in an article recently this week, cultural wars occurring across the country. And one of the reasons why they're occurring is because we won't sit down at the table and understand one another. Understand the belief systems are different, the needs are different, the goals are different. the American experience is different, right? And so the platinum rule acknowledges all of those nuances of the other person and not force my beliefs, my needs, my goals, my experiences upon them by treating them the way I want to be treated. Any comments or thoughts about these two critical rules to avoiding cultural collision?
Yes, Pastor.
Yes.
We had several comments. One of them was that they like the platinum rule. It makes sense. They have to understand and educate themselves. Well, the comment was, I also have to understand and educate myself on your beliefs. If we imagined ourselves or our family as the person, then we would be more compassionate.
Yeah.
And there's also another comment. Disney adopted the platinum rule several years ago, and I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And so this rule is a little more challenging because we typically operate from that place of cultural comfort that we feel. And oftentimes we project on others our beliefs, our goals, our experiences, and our needs. So what is culture? What would you say is culture? What is it? Anybody? What is culture? There's no wrong answers, right? There are no wrong answers. I had a guy in Eastern Kentucky say to me when I asked this question, he said, culture is what our folks do. And I thought it was the greatest interpretation of culture that I had ever heard in one of my trainings. Culture is what our folks do. Anybody else? What is culture? I see the chat room right now. What are they saying? What is culture?
They are saying the customs, arts, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social group ideas, beliefs, celebrations, or belief traditions. It connects people based on similarities, your uniqueness, a system of belief, values, and customs, a group of shared behaviors and customs, values and beliefs, a way of life, your own beliefs, culture, how you live, how you were raised, and how you were taught to treat others. There is a comment. The problem is that people forget that everyone wants to be accepted for who they are in regard to the golden rule and the platinum rule. It's the belief that shapes the way of our living, values and culture. The explicit and implicit rules of behavior accepted by a group, customs, and celebrations. And the lens through which we see the world.
Yes, all those things are great. Those are some very good answers because they're very consistent with this statement here. There are integrated patterns of human behaviors associated with the various groups that we as individuals associate with, right? And so many of us are part of many different cultures, right? I'm a pastor, and so there's the culture among other clergy members. There's certain patterns of behaviors that I exemplify when I'm with the pastoral culture, right? And then there's this professional consulting world that I operate in, and there's a culture among the professionals that I operate in that's different than my pastoral culture, right? And so the language is different, right? The behaviors are different. And then there's family culture, right? And so the persona and the nuances and traditions and beliefs and behaviors associated with my family group are different than my professional group, right? We all have these various cultures. They all have these patterns of behaviors, how we react to one another within those cultural settings. That's what culture is. It's all of those things that are part of the patterns of behaviors associated with the groups that we culturally align ourselves with. And many of us are members of many different cultural groups. And we, without thought, change our behavior from one group to the next group, right? And so that's what culture is. And sometimes you'll run into somebody whose culture, is totally different than yours. In some ways, you may even feel like their culture is a contradiction to yours. And so this is what we're here to talk about, is when someone has different thoughts that I have about something. Somebody has a different custom, right? And that custom seems strange or odd to me. Somebody has a different belief system around certain things, different than mine, right? Different value system, right? We're going to talk about beliefs and values very strongly in the second half. Thank you all. You're right. Culture is all those things. And then somebody alluded to this in the definition of culture when they said something about culture defines how we see the world, defines our lens for the world. And that's exactly true. Our culture defines our world for us, right? Culture defines how we receive people, how we receive information from others. It defines how we process our encounters with others. It defines what we think of others. It defines how we react and respond. Our culture does that. It defines the world for us. And so, therefore, I can only see the world through my cultural experience. I can't see the world as a white female, right? I see the world through my lens as a Black, northern urban man. I grew up in South Side Chicago. Those experiences, the traditions, the customs of living in Chicago as a Black man in the 60s and 70s, all have contributed in shaping the cultural lens through which I see the world. The experiences that came along with that, growing up in the South Side of Chicago as a Black man, all became a part of the customs, beliefs, the value systems that I have, and therefore I see the world through that lens, right? So in the book, White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo talks about racial framing. Here's where I want you guys to chime in. I want to hear your thoughts about the racial framing as a child growing up, as a young adult growing up. I want to hear your thoughts about racial framing. So here's what she says. The racial framing describes the bits and pieces of cultural information, images, stories, interpretations, omissions, silences that are passed on within a group from one person to another, from one generation to another. She said that the pieces of cultural information that were passed on in images, right? I remember certain images as a kid growing up. Stories, interpretations, sometimes there were things happening in the news and my parents gave me an interpretation, right? All of those things kind of contribute to my racial framing, right? The framework from which I start to view the world. There were some things that they kept silent and some things they didn't tell me about. And I had to find out in other places. These pieces were passed on in my family. And I found myself passing some of those same bits and pieces on to my children. Anybody got any examples of those bits and pieces of cultural information, images, stories, interpretations of things as a kid growing up, your parents gave you that became a part of that framework through which you started to experience and see the world through? Anybody got any examples of that? Bits and pieces, stories, interpretations, silences. Yes.
Okay, we have culture is what makes people and community what they are. We have to be a chameleon because we have to adjust to that particular culture. How to behave in public or church. This one is I am a Latinx employee immigrant in one of the most affluent school districts in California, and it is becoming more and more difficult and emotionally exhausting to keep educating others. Language, food, celebrations. All of society looks like me, white. We aren't allowed to play in the front yard because that kids who lived on the bad side of town lived. To be silenced and not make trouble. Mothers do not work outside the home. Throughout my childhood, I saw all people, regardless of race, as people, humans. I was not exposed to racial framing until I became an adult. I felt rocked the boat. I could see it was not an equal playing field because we had a Black maid who lived down the road in a shack. Rich history of all types of music, African American history, love of family. College is the next step after high school. growing up in the Midwest and Northeast, I would say silence is what I heard. Don't do anything to anyone that you wouldn't do in front of your grandma. My parent let me know everyone did not mean good for me. And also let me know that I am good and can do anything I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
A childhood memory was to never leave the store without a receipt or bag.
Mm-hmm.
As a country farmer, I was told I would not be able to succeed in city life. Families, culinary traditions, foods, and customs. Seeing magazines in my home, Ebony, Judd, Essence, TV shows, Cosby Show, A Different World, Julia. This is as my mother would tell me stories about how she had to pick cotton in the fields and how they were treated growing up because they were black. People outside our family were not part of the real life. Always let people be more happier to see you coming and going, or coming to going. Our parents did not openly discuss racial things. We were never made to feel less than others. 2 parents in the home. Mother took care of the home. Father worked.
Mm-hmm.
This one, remembering how we could not eat at lunch counters in certain stores. Funerals are a celebration of life. Shouldn't be sad. Bits and pieces, TV shows watched, family history stories, religious interpretations. The exposure to black dolls and images that look like me.
Yeah.
Growing up in California, I was shocked to learn about segregation, which my parents showed me photos of in the newspaper in the 50s. Grew up being told that girls are supposed to get married and have children. It would be disgraceful if a woman were to swear, smoke, or make more money than my husband.
Wow. So we see a lot of different pieces that contributes to that cultural framework, how we see things, right? Our culture forms the frame in which we socialize with others, right? But here's something that's very important that we understand, and we'll visit this later on in the presentation. Our culture could create barriers to gaining an understanding and tolerance of others whose cultures are different than ours. So depending on the strength of our culture, when we run into people whose culture is different, maybe they, for instance, treat their wives differently than we treat ours. Or maybe they love a different type of person than we love. Or maybe they have religious beliefs that are wholly different than our religious beliefs, right? That culture of ours could create a barrier to gaining an understanding and a tolerance of people whose culture are different than us. So ultimately, to avoid that cultural collision, we have to get to a level of understanding people are different than us and gaining some level of tolerance where we don't have that collision, where we don't have that conflict, constant conflict, right? But ultimately, our culture could create barriers to gaining a level of understanding about somebody that prevents these cultural collisions from happening. So let's start with our first pop conversation around culture, and this is just to show how we were brought up and how sometimes we were told one thing, and then as we went out into the world, left our cultural bubble, if you will, we started realizing that some of the things we experienced in our culture were not necessarily accurate, right? And so let's talk about that. Here's the first question in our pop conversation. Were you told as a child growing up that race didn't matter? Race didn't matter. Anybody told that race? Somebody just unmute and just kind of have that conversation with me. It's okay if those in the control group just, if you want to unmute and just have a quick conversation with me. Were you told growing up that race didn't matter? Anybody?
Pastor, this is Jerica Aguilar. Yes, I was actually told that by my family. Race doesn't matter. We're all God's children. Race doesn't matter.
So Jerica, and when did you discover that wasn't necessarily accurate?
I discovered that in high school that I grew up in a white middle-class family, but I wasn't attracted to white middle-class boys. And so the first time I came home and told my dad, hey, so-and-so asked me to go out on Friday night to hang out, and he said, is it a white boy? And then I said, no, it's not. And it had never, I'd always been told, oh, race doesn't matter. But then when I got to high school, all of a sudden it mattered to him.
Wow, yeah. Anybody else? You were told, because that's the whole point of this exercise, is to really reconcile some of the things that we were told and yet some of the things we experienced, and the cultural, even within our own being, this cultural place of intersectionality with what our parents said and then what I actually experienced. Sometimes we experience that before we even get out of our parents' home, with some of the contradictions to what they said and their reaction to certain things. And so anybody else, culture, race didn't matter. Anybody else? All right, well, I'll go to the second question. Will you message, what was that message like around equality? Where you message that, hey, everyone was equal. Everyone was equal in this world. And if so, did you come to a place or a scenario or a situation in your life where you realized that, again, equality is not this message of equality that I received is not necessarily true for all people? Anybody message that as a kid growing up? Everyone's equal.
Yes, Reverend Palmer, Pastor Palmer, I was told that everyone was equal in God's eyes. We were all the same. And I didn't recognize the differences and didn't experience it until high school, when it had nothing to do with dating. It was just, I began to see that all the white people went one way and all the black people went another way and congregated in different ways, and realized, okay, well, the people that are chosen for certain things were all white. I noticed those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But, you know,
and oftentimes we notice inequality around gender, right? Everybody's equal. You can do whatever you want to do until you say, I want to join the football team. Oh, girls don't play football.
right.
I want to join the baseball team. Oh, no, girls don't play baseball. No, your brothers can go outside and play baseball. You stay in the house, right? There was always these contradictions of these messages. Hey, everyone is equal until, right? Anybody else? All right. So this next question, I want you to think about what social life looked like as a kid growing up, right? Not just at school and recess, but once you left school and now you're home, maybe for the summer. And what did your social environment look like? Was there diversity of racial and ethnic groups in your social environment? Was there a lot of diversity? And I'm not just limiting this to racial and ethnic groups. Were there groups living alternative lifestyles, where there were two dads or two moms? Were there groups from other parts of the world that maybe they looked the same, but they were different in cultural nuances and behaviors? What did your childhood experience look like as a kid growing up around diversity in your social environment? Did you experience diversity or not? Anybody want to?
Very little diversity. But what I did have was a young girl that I played with who was white, and we played together the whole summer. And almost near the end of the summer, she came and told me she couldn't play with me anymore. And I asked why, and she said, because you're not white. And I'm like, oh, okay. So that kind of woke me up as, how different people were. And she wasn't allowed to play with me just because of the color of my skin. And then in church, of course, it would be African Americans. Everything else was pretty much segregated. Even though we were in a time of integration, it was still segregated.
Yeah, yeah. And for some who grew up in that era or grew up with a direct impact coming from parents who grew up in that era, when we got into the late 70s, 80s, and things started to become more diverse, it was an interesting landscape to maneuver, because all our lives we had been in this kind of segregated environment, whether it was because of informal customs of the area in which we grew up in, or because our parents kept us segregated, right? Whether that be all white, all black, all Hispanic, our parents kept us segregated to some point. And then all of a sudden, we launched out into a world that started to become a little bit more open to diversity, and yet we have this racial framework of isolation and monocultural realities. And now all of a sudden, we're living in a diverse dorm where they don't segregate the students. You could end up with a black or white or Hispanic or a foreign-born roommate. And now you come home and you say, hey, my roommate is Muslim from the Middle East. And now there's all of these cultural conversations around safety and things like that, right? This is the kind of framework that we have to work through with people who come into our areas of influence that are different than us, right? People we have to deal with sometimes that come from a different culture than we do. I'm going to fast forward through this. We'll get to some of those questions as we go through. So let's talk about connecting culture to behaviors and responses, right? So what is cultural competency? We hear a lot about this term, cultural competency. What is it? It's congruent behaviors, attitudes, policies, and practice, right? I want you to get those three things: behaviors, four things: behaviors, attitudes, policies, and practice, right? That enable agencies and professionals within those agencies to work effectively in a multicultural situation, right? It's congruent behaviors, attitudes, policies, and practice. We have to be very intentional in talking about the behaviors, the attitudes, the practices, and shape policy that will help us to work with everyone in our work environment, help us to serve everyone we could possibly serve in the work that we do. We've got to talk about what's inappropriate and what's appropriate, right? You don't get to cultural competency without having some very intentional conversations about how we react and respond to people based on these different cultural nuances, right? Got to be very intentional in making sure that we shape policy that identifies and clearly articulates what's allowable, what's not, right? What we don't do, how we do not respond to people. We have to be very intentional when we get a certain influx of people, right, that may not speak English well, that may have certain customs that may be somewhat different than what we're accustomed to. We have to be very intentional in saying, these are the things we don't do, these are the things this is how we respond to them. For instance, there are certain cultures you don't separate. You don't separate the man from the woman and talk to the woman, right? So how do I interview her when it's our policy to separate mom and dad? In the case of child abuse, we separate. Well, no, in some customs, you don't talk to my wife without me being present. How do we work around that, right? Or do we just blow through the intersection because we're the agency, right? So we have to begin to look at the customs of folks, make sure that we set policy and teach and train on the appropriate behaviors so that we can be effective in a situation where people, multiple cultures of people are present. It's a level of knowledge-based skills required to provide services to people of a particular ethnic or racial group. right? And so we're going to get to that point in the second half where we talk about how to develop the knowledge-based skills that you need to provide service to people of a particular race and ethnic group. Then it is the development of processes that evolves over an extended period of time. It's a developmental process that evolves over an extended period of time. I always tell folks, cultural competency is not a destination. It's the journey, right? And we're constantly learning about people. We're constantly learning the nuances about people who are coming and migrating into our community. We're constantly learning about new populations that we'll begin to serve that maybe previously we had not served. And we're constantly learning and growing and learning how to nuance our systems, nuance our responses so that we can be culturally competent and provide the service and hopefully achieve the outcome that we want to see for all families and children that we serve.
Pastor,
So,
go
ahead, Jill.
We just had just a couple of comments to share about that. That attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding and decisions activated without an individual's awareness or intent. They happen over the course of a lifetime, beginning at an early age through exposure, direct or indirect.
Yeah, that's stuff from implicit bias. I don't know if they got that from the implicit bias training, but that's verbatim what I said in the implicit bias training. So thank you. Yeah. So having understanding, awareness, cultural competency requires us to have an understanding, awareness, and acknowledgement of others that enables an individual or organizations to effectively function. But I want you to notice something. Understanding, awareness, and acknowledgement. You know what's missing? I'll tell you what's missing. Glad you asked. Agreement. Cultural competency requires understanding others. It requires an awareness of their culture, what's offensive, what's not. It requires acknowledgement of their culture. But it doesn't require agreement. You don't have to get off the cultural competency journey because you run into somebody who displays a belief or value or lack thereof just because you don't agree with it. You just have to understand it. You just have to be aware of it. And you have to be willing to acknowledge that that's their belief. But you don't have to agree with it. And you don't have to have a cultural collision because you don't agree with it. Right? Understanding must be without judgment. Understanding must be without judgment. Right? I understand in your culture, right? And how do I come to a level of understanding without judging that person? We're so, sometimes we feel so impressed to determine right or wrong based on our beliefs, right? Some people just do things different and it doesn't necessarily make it wrong, right? And so how do we understand people who are different than ourselves without judgment? Awareness must be accompanied with compassion. And acknowledgement must be with consideration of impact, right? So it's easy to judge a person who's poor for poor decisions. It's easy to look at somebody who's poor and see bad decisions that they may have made and judge them, right? And be harsh on them if you've never been poor, right? And so sometimes when we come to this place of cultural competence, we start to develop a level, we start to increase in our compassion towards people, we start to realize that the culture of poverty, the culture of violence, whatever it may be, could facilitate some of these bad decisions, right? And now I got a different lens on how do I help this person, as opposed to judging them, right? And so it doesn't require agreement. People make bad decisions. People make decisions that you have to deal with because they were illegal. Doesn't mean you have to agree with the decision. If you're going to help that person avoid cultural collision, then it will require understanding, it will require an awareness, and it will require knowledge of the impact of culture. So learning about people and trying to have these conversations, somebody said it earlier when they said, you know, I'm wore out with trying to educate people, right? And it is. It's tough when people are trying to come to a level of understanding, and then at the same time, you're tired of hearing people ask you, why do you this and why do you that? How did you get your hair like that? And Why do you wear those types of clothing, and so on and so forth? And it gets to a point where it's kind of wears you down. And so how do you get to a place of being able to have these conversations of understanding? How do you get to this point where and it's uncomfortable. It's difficult at times to have these conversations because sometimes folks don't know what to say, how to ask the question, right? So this is one of those examples from the sitcom Blackish. It's meant to be funny, so it's okay if you laugh. But what it depicts is the discomfort in terminology as you're trying to have these conversations. So go ahead, Jill, start. A bit of humor, but the point being and what they were talking about was the fact that his wife doesn't like him using the N word, doesn't like him using the N word in the house, and so so the whole piece was around her not wanting to use the N word, and the guy on the end wanted to get in the conversation. And of course, they voted for and of course, people erupted in emotions until he pointed out, the NAACP, and of course, the C means colored people, right? And so the discomfort, and I had a judge reach out to me just a month or two ago and asked me which was it appropriate to say Black or African American, right? And so people are trying to understand, but sometimes we just don't know the appropriateness of the questions we may want to ask, or the appropriateness of what to or how to refer to an individual, or to even make comments about someone's appearance, even in a positive sense, could maybe offend others. And so it's difficult and it's challenging and sometimes very tricky. So increasing our cultural competency is a journey. It's a journey that includes these 7 things. Learning, right? Remember, we can make the assumption of the golden rule and just treat everybody the way we want to be treated, or we can embark upon this journey of learning, right? And learning the cultural nuances of people, learning how people are different, think differently, believe differently, have a different value system and a different way of doing things, right? It requires multicultural communication, right? Having these conversations with people about their culture. Expansion of one's interpretation of others, right? Sometimes we are limited to those. Somebody mentioned it earlier when they did the implicit bias definition, right? We're limited to those images that we see on TV. We're limited to the interpretations that the media has given us. Some of us are limited to the interpretations our parents gave us, right? And I shared that very clearly with you. My parents grew up in the 40s and 50s in rural Arkansas. And so the interpretations they gave me of white America was totally different than my own experience, right? And so I've learned enough to have reshaped the interpretations I once had of people, right? The acceptance of a mixture of beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, right? And the key word being, again, acceptance. We talked about tolerance very briefly, accepting people's cultural nuances, right? And then a willingness to embrace others' cultures as a part of their solution, right? Oftentimes, we want to take people out of their cultural environments. We want to somehow change their behaviors and not identify that cultural nuance and embrace their cultural nuances as a part of their solutions, right? Their cultural, their solutions to their own problems, right? Engagement, right? Which means contact, means conversation, right? And then establishing trust by building a relationship, right? All of these things are required if we're going to increase our cultural competence. Have to start this, at least with these 7 pillars. Any comments before I go to the next section? I saw the chat room light up a couple of times. Christy, you want to tell us what folks are talking about in the chat room?
Yes. Well, one was that was funny, so I'm sure that was about the video. I never liked the N-word and do not use it. I do find it offensive when anyone uses it, no matter what race or culture. Laughter is always an icebreaker in any culture and is a way to build a rapport across diverse people to address and tackle the serious and difficult topics. When I lived in Hawaii, I loved learning about the different cultures. I would ask what was their nationality and ask them to share their cultures. I was like a sponge and still love learning about local and world cultures. There was another one that my Japanese American friend invited me to celebrate Buddha's birthday, which my parents attended with me. I enjoyed different ethnic food every Friday night, which was fun. Another one was, in my case, I grew up overseas and my family was the only Black family in the neighborhood, and I was okay. Actually, I was an A student all my life. That said, I shared the same faith, being Muslim, with everyone else. Still, there were economic-based discrimination, national and economic migrants that was inhumane, but never physical or color or race-based. A disclaimer, I left in the 1990s, so I'm not sure if the situation got better or worse since then.
Yep. Yeah, and I too lived in, I'm sorry, somebody said something? Yeah, I too lived in Hawaii, and you're right that the culture is unique over in Hawaii. In fact, you'll see people who look the same but have various different cultural nuances, and so you can make a lot of assumptions about the locals and realize you're talking to different cultural, talking to different cultures of people. Same thing with my trips to Africa. There are different cultural nuances among the people who look similar and live in the same country, but yet they have different cultural nuances across tribes. And so again, very, very interesting. We're not going to do this second exercise because it's one I built for in person, so we can't necessarily do it. So let me give you 3 ways really quick that one could respond, 3 ways in which one could respond to culture. One is you could clash with culture, right? And we're seeing a lot of that in the media today, right? We're seeing a lot of clashes with culture, right? And it's you take the viewpoint that your behaviors are the right ones and the only ones, right? And so we're reluctant to sit down at the table and have a conversation. Instead, we run to our respective corners, and then we start to refuse the other viewpoint. And so we have a lot of that going on right now in the country, whether it's political divide, whether it's racial and ethnic divide, whether it's socioeconomic divide. We have a lot of division of divisiveness going on right now in the country, and a lot of cultural clashes happening in the country, right? So that's one viewpoint. You can just take the viewpoint, it's my way or no way, right? You can refuse, right? And so people who refuse or respond to culture by refusing, they simply isolate themselves from the larger populace and avoid having to be infringed upon with the cultural behaviors of it. Hey, that's their problem over there. It's not mine. I don't care what's going on in Chicago, right? That has nothing to do with me, right? And so I'm just going to get off work and go back to my homogenous community and my people, and it doesn't bother me, right? And so we can refuse. We can just say, I'm going to live in my world and let you live in yours. This has nothing to do with me. The third way you can respond to culture is you can embrace it, right? Meaning you can adapt to and accept the diversity of others. Then that's hard because I like the way I am. I like the things that I believe in very strongly. I like the things I value very strongly. And it's easy to clash. It's easier to refuse. It's tough to say, I don't agree with that, but I guess I can work with you. I guess I can adapt a little bit. I guess I can accept that different perspective. You understand others when you embrace culture, right? You adjust your behavior, your behavioral norms to fit with others in society instead of just demanding that they adjust to meet yours, right? You embrace the cultural norms of others as a part of their identity. In other words, you're okay with leaving people the way they are. You're okay with accepting their cultural identity and not necessarily have to change them to get along with them. You know, there are some schools that have policies against cultural identity pieces with people. No dreads. For some people, that's cultural. That's spiritual. And yet schools have said no dreads. Right? Got to have your hair cut to this length. You can't have braids. You can't have, dreadlocks. You got to, and they won't allow students, or they won't embrace that cultural norm as a part of that student's identity. Right? Comments, thoughts? Christy?
Well, we have a couple of questions. What is appropriate, African American or Black, or is this something you have to ask? Is a question?
Yeah, I think that most people will be okay with African American. I typically refer to myself as a Black man. I think that what would really be appropriate and what really would be the perfect world is if we can deconstruct the construct of race and realize I'm just a man. And Christy, you're just a woman. You're not a white woman. You're just a woman. And I'm a man. And the fact that we got to go with these titles is because we've been somewhat convinced that race matters. It matters that you're a white woman. And it matters that I'm a Black man. Because you're a white woman and I'm a Black man, there's certain things I'll never say or do to you or do with you that I would do with Gwen. I walk up to Gwen and say, hey, Gwen, how you doing? But I'd be less hesitant to just walk up to you in public place and hug you, right? Because the construct of race. So I said a lot to answer that question, but I think the perfect world is where that's not even a question, right? I see you as a woman. I see you as a human being. I see you as an intelligent person. I see you as a smart person. I see you as a beautiful person. I see you as God's creation and not a white woman, right? And so, but I think most people of color, Black people would probably embrace either term. I have not run into a lot of folks that are just bent on a preference. I call myself a Black man, but I've heard people refer to me as an African American, and I'm okay with it.
Okay. Well, we did have a couple of other comments too. Growing up in a military-based community, we embrace many different cultures. That is why I loved my anthropology courses in college, understanding ethnocentric views.
Yep.
I lived outside the U.S. for 10 years, and Americans were known for their arrogance and cultural snobbery. Most avoided embracing the African culture and insisted on speaking English, and that their way was the best way to do things. Well, this one, I once served on a board that had rules concerning hairstyles and failed to embrace ethnic styles.
California just had to pass a law. California just had to pass a law about that, right? Saying that you can't discriminate against African American women who wear their natural hairstyle, which in some cases would be a big afro. And they had to actually pass legislation because Black women were being discriminated against in the workplace because of natural hairstyles. Yeah.
Okay. I have another one. Oh boy, most of my race, religious, and nationality clashes started in North America. Before that, my arguments were with my parents about more space and time with friends as a teen. Nonetheless, it was with people I love and trust. Certainly not strangers, which I have to work with.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry, that's it?
Well, there's a question. It says, why are Blacks the only ones that can't be themselves? Other cultures are more accepted.
That's the question. I think we have time to answer today. We got lots of, when we get to the next iteration of this training, we talk about Let's Talk Race. We'll really talk about how African Americans in this country have carried the stigma of the construct of race and the inferiority piece specifically with that construct through generations. And so, and we've even internalized, and we'll talk a little bit about internalized racism in that training as well. We've even internalized some of that racial construct to where we stratify one another. We have the different statuses that we put on each other based on skin complexion. So, yeah, I agree. Why do we even have to have these types of conversations? So, so I look forward to that next training when we talk about Let's Talk Race. So it's 10 after the hour. Let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back at 1:20 your time, and we'll start to play a music video so you can go about doing what you're doing. Just keep your volume on, and you'll hear music, and you'll know you've got about 3 minutes before we come on. All right, welcome back. Welcome back. No, that was not video footage from recent occurrences in cities across this country. That was video footage from back in the days of the Civil Rights Movement, 50s and 60s. And I say that sadly because yet we see similar images playing out in American cities 60 years later. And so, and I think many of us have probably asked that question, what's going on? I mean, I want to know what's going on. It's called national cultural collisions. Having, as again, I read earlier this week, cultural wars. And I think it's because we won't come to a place like today and really have constructive and productive conversations about our differences and how to have conversation even when someone believes, values, have different customs than we do. So, yeah, I love that particular video because I find myself sometimes looking at the news, asking that question. So let's talk about what is a cultural collision. What is a cultural collision? It occurs through ignorance of another's culture. And I don't use ignorance as a negative term. I don't think it's a bad term at all. There are things we just don't know about each other. And when we don't know, we make assumptions, and oftentimes we have these cultural collisions. So they occur through ignorance of others' cultures or the unwillingness to acknowledge the presence of cultural nuances. What is a cultural collision? It's when judgment, decisions, and actions are made without the consideration how they impact people culturally, right? When we make decisions about people, take actions about for or against people without considering the impact of culture. Cultural collisions occur when systems entrenched in policies and practices that impact some cultures in disparate ways fail to recognize and revise those policies and practices to address the disparate outcomes. So we looked at some data in the implicit bias training, and that data reveals in some of our systems disparate outcomes, right? And when we refuse or we're unwilling to look at the banking policies and practices in this country and how they disadvantage some populations and advantage others, when we're unwilling to look at the redlining construct in this country and look at what it does as far as the housing situation in this country, and we continue to let these policies and practices that disadvantage some and advantage others exist, then we continue to have these cultural collisions. So when we talk about impact of culture, here's a video from the movie Hardball, where Keanu Reeves is a baseball coach. These inner city kids. He drops the kids off to go back into their apartment complex, and there's a gang situation going on, and then violence erupts. Right? And the violence, the culture of violence that erupts impacts these two boys here. And the question is, how do we deal with the impact of that culture on subsequent behavior? Think about it. Go ahead, Kelly. Jill. be okay. It'll be okay. Will it really? Will it really be okay? What's going to happen to that kid? What's the impact of this culture of violence that this kid lives in? In the juvenile justice world, we call this indirect effect. In other words, this kid can't control the family he was born in. He can't control the community he's being raised in. This kid can't control that. And yet, this culture that he's growing up in is going to impact his decisions. So now he shows up at school and he has a weapon. Maybe not a firearm, but he has a weapon in his bag. Maybe he has a stick. Maybe he has some nunchucks. Maybe he has, a little slapstick to fight with, because he saw violence, and the violence took his baby brother's life. And now he's in front of me, a juvenile offender. And do I treat him like a thug? Do I treat him like a violent criminal? Or do I recognize the impact of that violence, that culture of violence that he lives among? Do I recognize the impact of that event on this child? Or do I just go through the intersection and treat him like just another bad kid from the wrong side of town, right? Culture has impact. That culture of violence impacts that kid. Now, maybe he's not intending to go to school and harm anybody. He just has a weapon as a part of his safety plan. And as his juvenile worker, do I treat him based on what he did, or do I peel back that onion a little bit and understand what happened to him, the impact of the culture in which he lives in his decision, and help him make a better safety plan, one that's not illegal, right? Oftentimes, if we just take time to listen and learn, we realize that because of some cultural pieces, people make decisions that we ourselves wouldn't imagine making that decision, right? Culture and its impact. Culture requires four things, and this is where we start to get a little tricky as we work through the second half. Culture requires four things: the right level of awareness, the right attitude. We're going to deal with attitude. That's the crux of it. The right knowledge and the right skill. Culture requires these four things. Christy, is there anything that we need to adjust before we dig into this last leg from the chat room?
We don't want to peel back the onion because they can be helped so a difference is possible. And another one is not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you. We need trauma-informed as well as trauma-responsive communities.
Yeah. So much can be learned instead of just dealing with what did you do. I've trained this. Now, what did you do? What happened to you? And it's about having folks that behind every kid there's a story. And that story needs to be heard. That story needs to be understood, because it's that story that impacts the decisions that many of our young people are making. And until we understand the cultural impact of some of the conditions, circumstances in which they live, we'll continue to go through that intersection and destroy young lives with those policies and practices that don't consider cultural impact. So, recognizing the intersection between culture and race requires those four things. Awareness, right? Awareness starts with recognizing our own deep-seated stereotypic responses to different people. Remind yourself of the implicit bias conversation, right? Our own deep-seated responses, right? We've got to be willing to have that conversation and to realize that there are certain reactions I have to people who say don't speak good English, right? I once did training for our and one of the things that they found difficult to understand about others' culture was this idea that they come to this country and the least they could do is learn the language. That was their response. And they were annoyed by having to try to serve people who didn't speak good English. And so they were having these constant collisions with them, right? And so their complaint was, the least they could do is learn the language. Many people didn't plan, long periods of time to come to this country. Many of them were running from something, escaping something, and along the way, didn't have time to learn the language, right? And so, recognize stereotypic reactions to people, and then recognize the presence of stereotypic actions to different cultures, right? Recognize their cultural blind spots when it comes to our values and our beliefs. We'll deal with that in the next piece when we talk about attitude. But we got to be able to recognize that our values and beliefs sometimes create these cultural blind spots to understand, and having the willingness and the energy to embrace and tolerate someone's culture may be different than ours. Utilize data and research to increase our own awareness about stereotyping through the media and through the norms that others engage in. There's tons of research that will inform us on the disparate impact that minority and other cultures that come to this country experience as a result of stereotypic responses to folks within our system. Such as this. A new study suggests, they did this study where they would flash faces, these implicit association tests, they'll give you a button, and it's all measuring your reactions, your quick responses to things. And they would flash a face and then flash an item. And this particular study revealed that people were most likely to view the next item as a weapon after seeing a black face as opposed to a white face, right? So people quickly recognized the next, and the item was never a weapon. They were quick to think it was a weapon after seeing a black face versus a white face. There's tons of research out there that tells us or suggests to us that young black males are stereotypically associated with violence and crime, right? Awareness means be aware that these stereotypes within society exist. Those who went through implicit bias remember the microaggressions in society and how black dolls in a particular retailer were marked down and moved out of clearance aisle into the lawn and garden. This was after Halloween, right? Going into the busiest shopping season of the year, and yet all the black dolls were marked down and moved clearance, devalued, and put over in the lawn and garden, right? Here's a video from the sitcom Blackish, and even within the same racial family makeup, there's this feeling of being different because of skin tone, and so I've heard people share with me that they had extremely light-skinned folks in their family that they felt received different treatment. So this video kind of talks about that within the family construct here in the sitcom Blackish. Let's look at that.
Who did you behind our
attitudes. Awareness, right? Being aware of those cultural nuances of others, right? Being aware of our own stereotypic responses to others, right? Any comments? I saw some comments. Somebody said something about this is very much happening within families. Talk to me, Christy. What were people saying in the chat room?
I think we've been blind to the blind spots for so long that our cultures reflect that in present day, and that is what we need to change. Yes, we are often hindered by our own cultural lens and lack of knowledge and awareness. It's sad of the expectations to know better English if you're going to be here. Pure lack of cultural sensitivity and care. There's such a difference in attitudes generationally. This happens a lot. We are so conditioned, we do it ourselves at times.
Yeah. So from awareness, we go to attitude, right? Attitude deals with the values and beliefs that convey the extent to which we will be open to views and opinions and beliefs, and customs, issues, and ways of doing things that are different than ours, right? The stronger our values and beliefs, the more difficult it is, right? Our attitude is impacted by the strength of our values and beliefs, right? So the stronger the values and beliefs are, the more difficult and the more likely we're going to be conflicted when they collide with cultural differences, right? And so this is what we're seeing right now, right? We're seeing this play out in our country where people are expressing frustration on one side, some are expressing, this adherence to the institutions, and not really having a conversation about the disparate impact, the disproportionality, and as it relates to police shootings, and so we're having this collision, right? And it's because people feel very strongly on both sides of this issue, right? And the stronger those values and beliefs, the more conflict we're going to experience, right? So I said that to warn you about the next three images, and I want you to hang in there with me. Don't check out. Be watching the participation. Don't check out on me because I want us to talk about it. I want us to work through this. But these are all images that, to some degree, have created division in our society. They have caused people to be on one side or the other. And oftentimes, when we're talking about these images, there's division going on, sometimes within the same family, right? I've had conversations about each of these images with people in my social circles, and we have not necessarily seen them from the same lens. And so these could be places of cultural collision. So let's kind of work through it and let's talk about it a little bit, okay? You may actually learn something about these particular pieces that you didn't know. What do you think about that? What do you think about that? This has been a national controversy, and we have a lot of debates about this. Folks want to kick them out of the country, kick them out of the league. What are the reactions and responses to this? I see the chat room is lighting up now.
It is.
What's your attitude, right? This cuts at the heart of some of our values and beliefs, and the stronger those values and beliefs, the stronger those values and beliefs are, the more difficult it's going to be to address this, right? So what are we hearing in the chat room?
Okay, we are hearing a lot in the chat room. Divisive, he's a hero. It is his right. Thumbs up. Freedom of speech. Respect. Until we are free, no one is free. Or until we all are free, no one is free. Support his protest. Courage. Peaceful protest. Slavery was the worst thing that could have happened to Black people. The psychological ramifications still exist. It is so sad. Support, I support him, support his protest, standing up for his belief, courage. That's his freedom of speech. and respect and admire him now more than ever. No one listened to him because they thought he was a troublemaker and didn't listen to the heart of the message. This is a peaceful protest. This is right. I support him. Someone did say, I am confused about it, to be honest. A hero, very brave man, willing to take a stand. Yes, it is called colorism, but within our community, we have just called it the light skin, dark skin issue. Stand in support with Keep. Started a new movement. I, for one, love that Kaepernick positively protested and kneeled on behalf of his beliefs. A different take on what respect means, freedom of speech, advocate for equity, brave. He did the right thing. Back when I first saw it, I didn't understand, but once I heard why, I fully support.
Yeah. So this group has been very kind. And so there may be others in the broader group that have some of these typical responses. So I hear disrespectful to the flag. I hear disrespectful to our service members, disrespectful to our country. If you feel that way, you can leave. And I get all of those responses based on individual beliefs, value systems, based on the flag, the national anthem. As a service member, and I do want to thank all of our service members, former or present on the call, for your service. I did 10 years in the military, in the Army myself, and we rose our right hand and we swore to defend the Constitution of the United States. Constitution of the United States. We swore to defend that. The Constitution says that Congress shall make no laws respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right for the people to peacefully assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, right? And so as a service member, we swore to defend the Constitution, and the Constitution gives people a right to protest, gives them a right to freedom of speech. Even if I don't agree with the speech, I swore to defend their right to speak it. And so it's not disrespectful to me when people use that right that I swore to defend. And so as a service member, if sent to a foreign land or if put in a position to defend that Constitution against a foreign enemy or domestic, I swore to do that because I don't like the KKK and I don't like the hate they spew when they walk down the center of some street with a legal permit. But I'd much rather live in a country where they can exist than one where they cannot. So this is not disrespectful for those of us who serve, because we serve for these rights, even though we may not necessarily agree with the expression. Now, disrespectful to the flag. There is federal policy about what's disrespectful to the flag, and this is not it. What's disrespectful to the flag is to carry it in a horizontal position, except on the casket of a fallen service member. And so every halftime, we see disrespect occur to that flag when marching bands all across this country carry that flag in a horizontal position. That flag is only to be flown from a staff to freely fly in the wind. It's never to be carried horizontally, except on the casket of a fallen serviceman. And so again, we have to understand and talk about again what his intent was, and not necessarily have these cultural collisions around his method. Right? I've never done anything but saluted that flag with pride and patriotism. But I also defended the right for him and other people to do things that I've seen done to that flag, whether it's wear it on a garment, burn it, tear it up, drape it around their bodies, all of which are disrespectful acts towards the flag. Many don't know that this is how Colin Kaepernick started his protest, sitting on the bench during the playing of the national anthem. And it was a service member that wrote to Colin Kaepernick, and they had a conversation. Kaepernick, he didn't actually write to Colin Kaepernick. article. And then he sent them a letter, and they had a conversation, inviting him down to the sideline, had a conversation. And so let's look at this conversation and see if this may impact some of your ideas about this protest. Somebody said, wow, I never heard this. Makes a big difference. And that's the point. That is the point. I appreciate that. I appreciate that comment because that's the point. Never heard this, right? But it makes a big difference. Any other comments in the chat room, Christy?
Yes. I do have a question too. What is the right way to protest? Is a question.
Yeah, I think any way that's consistent with the Constitution of the United States. I don't think that the problem isn't that what he's doing is inconsistent with the Constitution of the United States. It's consistent with the teams. They allow players. In fact, was the first player to take a knee. Tim Tebow took a knee for a right to life, and so it's not even inconsistent with the culture of the NBA, the NFL, Major League Baseball. They all have allowed players to display things, garments, shoes, socks, notes on their helmet for various causes. So I think the right way to protest is one that's consistent with the Constitution. And so the problem isn't that it's inconsistent with the Constitution. The problem is that sometimes when people are not saying what we want them to say, then we have a cultural collision because we want them to shut up and we want to be very divisive in how we go about contradicting their protest. And that's what the whole point of this conversation is. I may not agree with it, but it's a freedom, it's a right. I don't agree with the KKK, but they have a right. And as long as they're doing it within the laws of the Constitution and the states in which they operate, then I don't have to show up. I'll just avoid the street that they're marching on that day, right? I don't agree with anything they stand for, but I protect, and I'm willing to protect their right to be able to protest. And so that's the struggle. The struggle is when we don't agree with it, then we begin to have these cultural collisions as we begin to try to contradict or deny somebody. In this case, denied employment because we didn't agree with the way he protested. Any other comments?
Yes, we have different cultures see things differently. People fought for independence, so it seems like a slap in the face for anyone who does not honor that. For some, it does not represent independence because it did not happen for them. It's hard to understand sometimes when you have not gone through it. A great example of a peaceful protest. It's about perspective. It takes an incredible amount of courage and dedication to do the right thing, to sacrifice everything he has worked his whole life to achieve. And there were several other comments in looking back at them about he's paid the price. Now the NBA, NFL back social justice, but he still has no job. Someone else, I can remember years ago when it was okay for football players to kneel. He used his platform to draw awareness to a serious issue, standing up for what he believed in. The flag has not represented all people.
Go ahead, Chris.
My husband is a disabled veteran and fully supports kneeling in peaceful protest. In the land of the free, shouldn't I be free to stand, kneel, or sit? Isn't that my right?
And I think, again, the point to take away from here is I'm not trying to change anybody's belief. I'm not trying to change anybody's opinion, right? The point is how do we avoid this from being a collision, right? A divisive issue, right? When clearly, he chooses to protest in a way that is peaceful. He's not bothering anybody. And when you look at this video, you realize that picture of him kneeling was actually him trying to take a step towards his opposition. The service member said, I was angry. So he wrote this letter, right? And Colin Kaepernick said, hey, man, let's talk, right? And he did the right thing. He said, hey, I want to know how you feel. You're a service member. You gave your life, was willing to give your life for this country. So let's have a conversation. It was from that conversation that he says, yes, I'll take your advice and kneel. If that's respectful, and it'll get the attention to this issue that I want, but at the same time respect you and your fallen comrades, but it didn't matter. Because we want to revert back to the day where you do what we tell you to do, or else. And the reality was him kneeling was actually him trying to take a step towards the other side of the issue, right? And so sometimes it just takes a little bit of understanding around the issues. And again, I've never done anything but stood and saluted for that flag, right? But I understand his right to take the knee, and I understand the issue that made him go to that protest. Get attention to this issue. Thank you all for those comments. The next polarizing issue or image, Black Lives Matter. What do you think about that? And again, I don't use this. I use this totally because it's one of those issues that have become divisive in our nation. I'm not here to support them. I'm not a part of this organization. I'm not here in any way. Just as a point of contact, this has been an issue where we've had, as a nation, we've had cultural collisions on it. Very divisive. And let's talk about why. So what are people saying? What do you think about this particular image?
Awareness that we matter and will continue to demand justice and be treated equally. Depends on what source and where you heard the information from regarding, that was about his kneeling. This is because Black Lives Matter, an awareness movement, very frustrating and divisive. Black Lives Matter is about raising awareness of inequality, fully support. Black Lives Matter, Black Lives do matter. There's a lot of confusion about the organization and the sentiment. Mm-hmm. The statement to say Black Lives Matter too, this just shows that we are humans, that we're important, they matter, fully support. I believe in the movement. I don't see anything wrong with this. All life matters right now, but it seems a lot is happening to Black lives. Black Lives Matter is not an organization. It's me saying that my life matters, my family's life matters.
Yeah. Yeah. So another issue.
But that's okay.
Go ahead.
They keep coming in.
Yeah, I can see.
This one says, I think it's sad that we have to have movements like this, but totally understand BLM is important. Our president said it's a terrorist group. It's a movement. Completely do not understand the violence. Do not understand. We have to love our neighbors that are hurting our Black brothers and sisters. This one is the Black Lives Movement. I do not support. However, I do think there is a problem in some areas with police. Agree that Black Lives Matter. Do not agree with looting and rioting to try to get to the point across.
Yeah.
If you are not Black, you will not understand. It is the lens of life you look through.
Yeah. So let me go back in, Chrissy. So when we look at this, I've heard all kinds of sentiments around this, and all on and on. And they're terrorists, they're not terrorists. And again, everybody could have an opinion, one way or the other. But this organization, this phrase, rather, was developed to draw attention to the sentiment that our lives don't matter, right? And they don't matter as it relates to police brutality. However, COVID-19 has really kind of shined some light on the cumulative disadvantages that minority populations have experienced that predisposes them to the worst outcomes in COVID-19. So now, this phrase is not just about policing, it's about public health, it's about mental health, it's about education, it's about socioeconomics, it's about housing, it's about all the institutional constructs that since the days of slavery have disadvantaged minority populations, and specifically Black and indigenous populations in the history of this country. But why do they say Black Lives Matter? Well, there's a reason that this movement feels the need to have that as their hashtag. The University of Iowa law professor David Baltus found that during the 1980s, prosecutors in Georgia sought the death penalty. 70% of Black defendants were white victims, but only 15% of white defendants were Black victims. What a disparity. 70% of the Blacks who had a white victim, they sought the death penalty, while only seeking the death penalty for 15% of the white defendants were Black victims. That's why they felt the need to say Black Lives Matter. In 2001, researchers found at the University of North Carolina, they released a study of all homicide cases in North Carolina between 1993 and 1997. And what they found was that the odds of getting the death penalty increased 3.5 times if the victim was white rather than Black. 3.5 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim was white rather than Black. Again, let the data kind of inform, our research around some of these things that we may instinctively, have an issue with, but I'm just trying to develop some sympathy and some way of connecting with this group to understand why they have such a, what I may feel is a divisive phrase, Black Lives Matter. In 1987, the Supreme Court, in the case of Murkowski versus Kemp, a death penalty case, the Supreme Court said that the court ruled this. In the case, racial disparities in the case were not a violation of one's constitutional right of equal protection under law. So what they proved was disparity, racial disparity in the prosecution of certain Black cases in the South. I think this case was a Georgia case, but it don't cite me on that. I got to go back and relook at that. But the Supreme Court said even if you prove this racial disparity, it's not a violation of the constitutional right to equal protection under the law. 2019 report that black people are 3.5 white people killed by white. We're only 13% of the population. But 3.5, when police killings happen, black people are 3.5 times more likely to be the victims of those killings than the majority population. 30% of black people killed in 2015 were unarmed, compared to 21% of white people. Again, African Americans are only 13% of the population. 13 of the largest U.S. City police departments kill black men at higher rates than the U.S. murder rate. 13 U.S. cities. And 69% of black people killed by police in 2014 were non-violent and unarmed. So it's not about crime. This is why they felt the need to say, hey, Black Lives Matter, right? Because there's data. There's actual data that will tell the story. As a result of seeing this happen over and over and over again, somebody came up with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Now, this is not about that organization. This is not about the people who infiltrate some of their rallies and their demonstrations with violence and looting. This phrase, however, this phrase that my life matters, in view of this kind of data, in view of these situations happening across this country, right? I mean, a white teenager left Illinois with an assault rifle, a military-style assault rifle, driven by his mom to Wisconsin, shot a couple people, and as the police respond to shots fired, they run right past him. He gets in the car and drives back to Illinois. That's why we say Black Lives Matter. I'll just go through these next slides. I think we said it. What do you think? Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go back to that comment. Before we go to the next polarizing image that you've already seen, any comments, Chrissy, about the second polarizing event? Right?
Yes, we have several comments that, well, and there's some comments about some documentaries, the 13th documentary and the Khalif Browder story. There was, there's a comment, there was a protest once where the protesters turned violent and inflicted considerable damage on their own neighborhoods and property. Today we call it the Boston Tea Party. And there's some comments about the police supporting the police and that some it's bad seeds that make good police officers look bad. And who knows how many racist police are out there. So wrong that some officers are out on the street to arrest, hurt, and even kill Black people. And I think this is maybe some comments on the data, but it's that people are put in juvenile detention versus being tried as an adult.
I think it's about 55% of juveniles who are transferred to adult court in this country are African American. So to that statement there, and to the statement of good police, you know, I'm a police chaplain, certified police chaplain, carry a badge, ID, and I respond to, you know, death notifications, things like that. Try to administer to our police department when they have a traumatizing event, as well as families in our community. So I'm very pro-police. And I talk with our chief, you know, several times throughout the week. And I do agree. I think there's a lot of men and women, Black, white, otherwise, out there wearing the uniform that are good people. But my challenge to good police officers is I really need you to join not enough to just say support the police. The police need to support the community. And we do need to come together to say, for the bad ones, we don't need to let them hide. We don't need to make this us against them. Sitting on a man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and not have the same visceral response that we have when people are shooting at the police is not good. So we need to police things that these bad actors, and I agree, they're a very small percentage, but the good police officers need to defund the bad unions and the bad police tactics and say, no, this is not acceptable. It is not acceptable. And we really can measure the disparities of use of force in police departments across jurisdictions, and where we see a disproportionate amount of police force being used on this community versus that community, we should address, right? And so I totally agree that we don't need to be us against them. You know, I decided to be a police chaplain because I'm not one to talk about systems and institutions without being willing to become a part and become a constructive and a productive part, right? So again, how do we avoid those cultural collisions? By being willing to come together and have these courageous conversations. So I thank you all for the comments. This has been easier than I thought. What about this image? Typically when I do my class, I get a lot of energy around Colin Kaepernick taking the knee and a lot of energy around Black Lives Matter. And then you can hear a pin drop when I put this up because people are like, I don't know what to say, right? What do we think about this image? And again, the same intent. When I see this image, how do I avoid a cultural collision? Talk to me.
In the chat,
Yeah.
the chat box, there's several hatred, a symbol of hate. It makes me sick. It's outdated and disgusting. Represents hate, period. Offensive to me. Disgust. White supremacy. Hatred and ignorance. History and cultural diversity on this image. Makes me ill, and when I see it a lot in my southern state. Unbelievable, anti-American, Southern. I'm from the South, I'm white, and this flag represents people I'm afraid of. It needs to go, anti-American. It's a culture, hate and slavery, Southern heritage, treason. It represents hate, divisive. Makes me super uncomfortable.
Right.
I instantly become on edge. This has always disturbed me. I'm a white woman. Too many people are refighting the Civil War. Flying this flag says you want everyone to know you are a racist, period. The image makes me cringe. An old way of thinking.
Yeah.
So
listen to the things. So somebody said history, culture. Somebody said Southern pride, and so how do you? And then others said hatred, divisive. Wearing this makes you is because you want people to know you're racist. And again, how do I see that? And in my mind have those assumptions that he wants me to know he's a racist, or he's just being divisive. I still got to avoid that cultural collision. And I can't do that because I have a stereotypic reaction to this image, especially because you have it tattooed on your shoulder, because you have it tattooed on your cheek, because you're wearing a T-shirt, because it's flying from your pickup truck, right? All of that could be my stereotypic reaction. I still got to avoid the cultural collision. And I'm making a lot of assumptions about this person. And here's why I say that. A lady once shared with me, she went to she took her two daughters out to get earrings. They were 12 and 13, I guess. And they were going to get earrings. And the daughters without any knowledge of this image, saw this on a pair of earrings. And because of the colors, they liked it. And they said, we want these. The mother was with them, and she gave them a quick lesson on what that meant to some people and how it could stereotype them as being racist. And they didn't get it. But what if they had bought those earrings, their mother wasn't with them, and they bought those earrings? How many folks would have saw those two young ladies and made some assumptions about them, right? So even though I feel strongly against this image, right, how do I avoid a cultural collision internally when I'm trying to service somebody who happens to have this big and bold on the T-shirt in front of me, right? And I'm angry as all get out, right? And I'm making some serious assumptions about this individual, right? Because of what this image means through my cultural lens, right? Somebody's great-great-great-great-great-grandpappy is buried in the cemetery up the road next to the old Methodist church who fought under this battlefield. And he fought on the wrong team. He fought on the wrong side. He fought in the wrong war. But he fought under this battle flag nonetheless and died in that war. And that has been passed on. And he wears that because that was the service, the army, that his great-great-great-great-great-grandpappy fought. Now, I have my feelings and my reaction to this, but I still have to serve this young man. I still have to serve this family. And it's becoming difficult because of these assumptions I'm making based on my cultural reaction and response and stereotypes associated with this image. Right? I'm not here to argue for or against either of these images. What I'm here to do is to have each of us think about our reaction and response and how do we avoid cultural collision as we look at these images, whether it be Colin Kaepernick, Black Lives Matter, or this Confederate battle flag. Oh, comment in the chat room.
Well, yes, it is the foundational symbolism of inequality. What a difficult and paradoxical dilemma that to be one nation, all Americans, not divided or defined by races, we have to see and acknowledge race and the impact it has on individuals of color in our country. Use of the image in negative situations reinforces the negative. Just because something is cultural doesn't mean that it is acceptable in a civil society. People who say it celebrates their heritage means they are celebrating their history of family members owning human beings as property. When you know better, do better. No other country allows the loser's flag to fly or glorify them with statues all over the country. I'm Southern and used to see it as just Southern without all the baggage. As I have listened to discussions in the last years, I've realized how offensive it is to others.
And let me reiterate, guys, I'm not here to argue that right or wrong with this image. What I'm here to say is, how do I keep putting myself in the place of both sides of the argument? How do I keep this image, and the other images for that matter, from becoming this place of cultural collision, a place where I can't tolerate it, a place where I'm about to make negative decisions. So offended about the image. Right? So I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. And this idea that in a civil society that we should know what's right or wrong. My point is it's not illegal, right? And so for the image, for the individual, it may very well be okay and right. Heritage, Southern pride, my great-great-grandpappy, whatever their cultural attachment to this image is, I still have to render the best possible response to them as I can. And I'm looking at this image and I'm trying to deal with what's happening inside is the whole point, right? So, I'm really not here just to validate that this image is what you believe it to be and what you associate it with. I do agree it's been associated with a lot of hateful things and hate crimes and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean that I get to judge a 15-year-old kid wearing this to be a racist individual, right? And so I still have to serve this 15-year-old like I served the previous 15-year-old that came before me. And I can't respond and react to this image in a way that could predispose me to make a different decision, one less favorable towards this particular person, is the point, right? So thank you all. Let's go on to now. So that's the toughest part. It's all downhill from here. We made it through attitude, right? So we see how our attitudes and beliefs and values about certain things could really make it tough to deal with some of the emotional responses and reactions we have to certain things that people may believe or a value that's different than our beliefs or values. So that was the point of that exercise. Knowledge now deals with the more you know about different cultures, the more capable you are of avoiding collisions, right? The more capable you are of overcoming some of your internal reactions and responses to culture that are different than yours, right? Sometimes that means, kind of turning down the volume on some of your internal responses and reactions long enough to hear, long enough to understand, and at least be come to a place where you can acknowledge the impact of their culture, right? Somebody grew up in a certain part of the South, that particular image and that flag could have some very strong meaning to them. And they may feel that they are very much not racist, very much inclusive of all people, but for whatever cultural reasons, may still have some level of tied to that image, right? So how do I, even if I never come to a place of agreeing with that, how do I at least be made aware of it, acknowledge the culture and its impact upon them, and understand it, right? Knowledge of cultural differences is the starting point to managing how actions and decisions impact people culturally. Beginning of, right? And then knowledge is the beginning of addressing how culture impacts behavior, right? It's the beginning of understanding how a person's culture impacts their behavior. So in the movie, Remember the Titans, which is our next video, in the movie, Remember the Titans, Denzel Washington's team was not gelling. They were having all kinds of struggles and issues. Jill, if you get that keyed up, they were having all kinds of struggles and issues. And so in this video, Denzel Washington makes a point to actually push the envelope on their lack of knowledge of one another. They were having these cultural collisions on the field. They were having these cultural collisions in the game. They just were not coming together as a team. And it's because they were so different. And so this scene, he kind of pushes the envelope on them getting to know one another. Go ahead, Jill. So knowledge, right? Denzel kind of pushes the envelope on that, right? They were not coming together as a team. It was divided, us against them, the same team, kind of like we are as a country. United we stand, and they were not coming together. And so it was the whites against the blacks, and he realized, because you don't know each other. You think these differences are significant because you don't know each other. So I'm going to force you to get to know one another. I'm going to force that knowledge issue, force you to get to know the likes and dislikes, family, each other's family, the struggles that they had, right? Guess what happened? They became a team. They became the best friends. And as a team, they started winning knowledge, right? And then skills. Parlay what we've learned about different cultures into manageable practices that will result in more inclusive, culturally responsive experiences with others. Remember, the goal is not to try to change people. It's to try to understand and know people. And then make sure that we create an environment that is inclusive of their traditions, of their customs, that are inclusive of their cultural identity, right? And we don't make them feel different because they are different than we are, right? We're landing into those skills that will create more inclusive, culturally responsive experiences. And then manage differences in a way where they're an advantage and not a disadvantage. Right? Find how to use a person's culture as an advantage and not necessarily as a disadvantage. These 4 components will help you to manage the intersection of culture in a manner that results in the avoidance of divisions and best possible outcomes for all. You've successfully navigated the intersection of culture and race when you have attempted. May not always achieve, may not always succeed, rather, but you've attempted to achieve best possible outcomes for all parties in the intersection. So, as I get ready to close, what have we learned? We learned that culture consists of many things related to the integrated patterns of human behavior within a group of people. We've learned that culture affects how we receive information from others and how we process it. We've also learned that our culture could create barriers to understanding others and their culture. We learned that cultural competency requires understanding, awareness, and acknowledgement of others' cultures. It does not require agreement. It does not require that I agree with everything that another person believes in. We learned that there are 3 different ways you can respond to culture. You can clash, you can refuse, or you can embrace culture. We also learned that cultural collisions occur through ignorance and the unwillingness to acknowledge the presence of cultural influence. And finally, we learned that avoiding cultural collisions requires awareness, attitude, knowledge, and skill. Now, before I leave, again, I'm going to send a black baby doll to the first person to have registered for this conference. So if you are the first person and you registered for this conference, Gwen, do we know who that person is? Do we know who?
Yes, the first person was Leah Nickel.
Leah Nickel.
If Leah's not on the call, then we'll go to the next person.
All right.
We'll determine that later on.
Leah, if you're still there, you need to acknowledge your presence so that you can claim your prize. Can you say her name once again, Gwen?
Sure. Leah Nickel.
Leah,
Is that MIA?
No, LIA.
LIA. I can tell you.
Leah Nickel, you are the winner of the doll, but you have to claim it. Or we'll go, you are the first registrant, which makes you the winner of a black baby doll.
She is not on.
All right, who's the second registrant?
Okay. The next is Nancy Gregg.
Nancy Gregg, you are the winner of a black baby doll. If you are on the call, please claim your baby doll.
I don't see Nancy.
All right.
Okay.
Number 3,
Gabrielle Blake.
Gabrielle Blake. You are
She
the winner.
is on. Gabrielle is with us.
Gabrielle, you are the winner of the black baby doll. Please.
She said yay.
Huh?
She said yay. And yes, Gabrielle, you are a winner. Thank you for joining us.
Yes. Please forward your address to Miss Gwen or Jill or Christy, and I will get that baby doll out in the mail to you all. Thank you all for being a part of our second iteration of these discussions. I think it's been powerful. I wish we had the space in the room to have been able to hear from all 606 of you guys. But I hope that this has been constructive. I hope that it's been positive. I try my best to create a safe and inclusive environment for these discussions. And I always like to end with this: if I offended anyone, chalk it up to my head, not to my heart. It was not my intent. But these conversations can be uncomfortable and they can be challenging. But I think we did a pretty good job. And I want to thank my control panel. And of course, I want to thank my person in the shadows that helped this presentation to go off smooth. Jill, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I cannot wait until post-COVID so I can give you a big old hug.
Sounds great.
So I turn it back over to you guys, Christy, for the final word.
Thank you, Pastor Palmer, for the phenomenal presentation and guiding us through this important conversation today around the impact of culture. Truly impactful. On behalf of all the regional coordinators, we'd like to thank you for joining us today and engaging in this presentation. All recordings will be available on our TCCY website at tn.gov/TCCY. Under the Publications tab, you can click on Webinars. And as a reminder, if you're calling in today and need a CEU or Certificate of Participation, please email Gwendolyn Wright, that's GWENDOLYN.WRIGHT@tn.gov, your name and request for either a CEU or participation certificate. Attendees will start receiving emails next week with certificates and membership information about joining all of our local councils. So again, we thank you so much for joining us today. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Pastor.
Pastor Palmer,
Right.
thank you so much, sir. I appreciate your presentation. I appreciate, again, you taking the time to talk with Craig and me earlier this week. It means a lot, and we just appreciate you.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks a lot. You guys really helped me through this week. So thank you for not letting me get blindsided. Appreciate that.
Not going to let that happen.
Yes, thank you.
So
Emily,
our next one.
how are you?
Great, thank you.
Good seeing you.
Thanks. Enjoyed it.
Great. Good seeing you.
Me too.
All right. Christy, you did a great job. Thanks.
Thank you.
We are a
Pastor.
great team.
It was
I'm
really,
going to take you guys up.
it was such a
I think I'm
good.
going to take you and Jill on the road with me.
I'm ready.
You guys are great. Thank you, guys. See you soon.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Pastor.
Have a great weekend.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Y'all did good, kids. Real good.
Thanks, Melissa.
You tell I haven't swooped my hair since it dried. Let me say it that way.
I haven't done anything to my hair since it dried this way too.
This week.
This